It always starts quietly, with a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. My land sits just beyond the gated streets of Brookhaven Ridge, a suburban kingdom run by an HOA I've never belonged to. My property is different grandfathered in before the association existed, a small vineyard I've tended for years with my wife, Eleanor. We enjoy our quiet evenings, pruning vines and watching the sun slip behind the hills. Then Richard Harlow showed up. He was tall, in his late 50s, with silver hair cropped like he'd just stepped out of a police academy photo. His aviator sunglasses never came off, and his gait carried the authority of someone who missed being saluted. Neighbors whispered that he'd retired after 3 decades on the force. Now, he strutted through Brookhaven like the badge was still pinned to his chest. The first time I saw him, he was berating a teenager for riding his bike too fast on the cul-de-sac, threatening a citation. That word made me laugh until I realized he wasn't joking. Within weeks, Richard was everywhere, pacing sidewalks, staring at my vines, peering toward my tool shed with binoculars. He wasn't just another nosy retiree. He was searching for control, and I'd just been marked as his target the morning after Richard Harlow first appeared at my fence line. The neighborhood felt different, as if someone had flipped a switch and drained away the easy rhythm Eleanor and I had known for decades. For years, our vineyard had been our quiet corner of peace. We rose with the sun, tended the vines, and shared coffee on the porch while birds skittered across the grass. People waved when they passed, sometimes stopping to admire the trellises or ask Eleanor about her winemaking. Children ran along the fence chasing each other, and no one thought twice about it. Then Richard arrived, and suddenly every look, every whisper, and every pause in conversation felt like it carried judgment. It started with the letters. Of course, neat little warnings delivered in envelopes without return addresses. They arrived weekly, sometimes twice a week, and always slipped through the gate like some back-alley threat. The words were crisp, professional, and almost legalistic, but never signed. I could hear Richard's voice in every line, though, the clipped cadence, the self-assured certainty that dripped from each accusation. Unauthorized structures, non-compliance, visual disruption, failure to uphold community standards. They were the sort of phrases meant to intimidate people into silence. And judging by the whispers spreading down the cul-de-sac, they were working the vineyard, my father's vineyard, was being turned into a weapon against us. 2 acres of carefully tended vines suddenly branded an eyesore, the tool she'd accused of being a commercial facility, and our small gatherings of family for wine tasting described as business operations. All of it nonsense, all of it carefully constructed to wear us down. Eleanor told me to ignore it, that the law was on our side. "We're grandfathered in," she repeated, pouring me another glass of Cabernet late one night. "He can't change history." She was right, of course. But Richard didn't need to change history. He only needed to make enough noise to convince everyone else that we were the problem. The shift in our neighbors was the hardest part. These were people I had known for years. People who once asked me for cuttings from my vines or came by during harvest to share in the bounty. Now their smiles were tight, their eyes darted elsewhere, and conversations ended when I approached. At first I told myself it was a coincidence. Then I heard the whispers, troublemaker, non-compliant, won't play by the rules. Someone even muttered, holding out as if I were some outlaw resisting a rightful authority. Richard didn't just want me gone. He wanted me branded as an enemy of Brookhaven Ridge itself one evening. Eleanor and I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. A black SUV rolled slowly down the street, pausing just long enough at our gate to make my chest tighten. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. After a long moment, it moved on, but the message was clear. We were being watched. Eleanor tried to dismiss it. Delivery guy lost, maybe, but her hand trembled as she set down her glass. I squeezed it gently, though my own nerves were fraying when I finally confronted Richard. It was outside the community clubhouse. He was surrounded by a cluster of board members, his posture commanding, his arms folded like a general surveying his lieutenants. I marched up, heart pounding, and demanded an explanation. "These letters, these complaints, you know they don't apply to me," he smiled, calm and practiced, then told me it wasn't about deeds or legal rights. "It's about the good of the community," he said. "The community doesn't like outliers." Outliers. The word stung. He wasn't arguing about bylaws. He was casting me as an intruder, someone who didn't belong. Someone who had to be erased for the neighborhood to feel whole again. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Richard leaned close enough that only I could hear his final words. You don't want to test me. I've made harder men than you fold. It wasn't a threat delivered in anger. It was delivered with quiet certainty, as if he were stating a fact of nature. The weeks that followed were a grind of attrition. Inspectors arrived unannounced, sometimes twice in the same week, poking around the vineyard, measuring setbacks and asking questions about soil runoff. They always left with nothing, but not before costing me hours of time and hundreds of dollars in wasted paperwork. County clerks began calling with inquiries about business licenses and tax classifications, each one triggered by an anonymous complaint. Every trail led back to the same source, though never directly enough to pin him down. Then came the spray paint. One Saturday morning, Eleanor and I walked outside to find bright orange letters scrawled across the base of a trellis near the property line. Remove. The paint dripped, ugly and violent, against the wood I had built with my own hands. Eleanor's voice cracked as she whispered, "This is our home." "He can't take it." I pulled her into my arms, but my own voice shook as I promised. "He won't win." Deep down, I wasn't so sure Richard's campaign wasn't just about legal pressure. It was psychological. He lingered near our fence with binoculars, pretending to patrol the sidewalks like a cop still on duty. He started showing up at the grocery store when I was there, standing in the next aisle, silent, just close enough to make his presence felt. Once I caught him sitting in his truck at the end of our driveway, lights off, watching our house for nearly half an hour before driving away. When I told Eleanor, she tried to downplay it, but her sleep grew restless, her shoulders tense. He wasn't just targeting me. He was eroding us both still. Part of me admired his strategy. He knew he couldn't win outright. The county records were on my side. The law was clear. But he also knew that most battles weren't won in court. They were won in perception, in stamina, and in who could endure the longest. And he believed he could outlast me. Started documenting everything, photographs of him near the fence, copies of every letter, notes of every strange car idling outside our home. But even as I built a file thick enough to choke a lawyer, I knew the system moved too slowly. Richard wasn't waiting for a courtroom verdict. He was counting on us to break under the pressure long before it got that far. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact altogether. Some wouldn't let their kids near our property, as if the vines themselves were contagious. Invitations dried up. Even at church, a place that once felt welcoming, I sensed the cold shoulders. Richard's influence was spreading like mold. He didn't need to scream or shout. He only needed to plant seeds of doubt, and the community did the rest. One evening, after another county inspector had left empty-handed, Eleanor looked at me across the dinner table, her fork untouched. "What if he's right?" she whispered. "What if we don't belong here anymore?" The words gutted me. This was our home, the life we had built, the vineyard I had poured my soul into. And here was my wife, the strongest woman I knew. Doubting whether we could endure, I leaned across the table, taking her hand. "We've been here longer than any of them. We belong more than he ever will. And I won't let him drive us out." She nodded, but her eyes were tired that night. I stood by the window long after she went to bed, watching the empty street, waiting for headlights, listening for footsteps. My resolve hardened with each passing minute. Richard Harlow wanted a war of attrition. Fine, I could fight that war. But I also knew something he didn't. When a man has everything to lose, he stops playing by the opponent's rules, and I had already decided Richard Harlow was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Eleanor returned from town with groceries and found a notice stapled to our front gate. It wasn't one of Richard's anonymous letters this time. It bore the official Brookhaven Ridge HOA letterhead. My property, it declared, was in violation of community standards and subject to enforcement action, including potential liens and forced removal off non-compliant structures. I held the paper in my hands, stunned. They had taken his words and dressed them in official clothing, legitimizing his campaign against us. Eleanor's voice wavered. "They can't do this, can they?" "No," I said, though my throat was dry. "They can threaten, but they can't touch us. Legally, they don't have jurisdiction." "Legally," she echoed. As if the word offered little comfort anymore that evening, I marched to the clubhouse. Richard was there, as always, leaning against the wall while board members shuffled papers. I demanded answers and demanded to know why my vineyard was suddenly the business of an association I never joined. The board president stammered about community cohesion and visual consistency, but I could see the way their eyes kept flicking to Richard, waiting for his approval before speaking. He didn't say much, just stood with that smug half-smile that told me this entire performance was his orchestration. "You think you're untouchable?" he murmured when the others had drifted away. But everyone has a breaking point that night. Eleanor argued for the first time in years. She wanted to call a lawyer, maybe even sell the place and move somewhere quieter. "I can't keep living under a microscope," she said, her voice sharp with exhaustion. I slammed my fist on the kitchen table. "That's exactly what he wants. If we leave, he wins. Do you want him to win?" Her eyes filled with tears, and immediately I regretted raising my voice. She wasn't my enemy. Richard was. But his poison had already seeped between us, turning our sanctuary into a battlefield, days blurred into weeks, each one marked by a new tactic. Cars idled near the driveway late at night. Anonymous calls rang once, then hung up when we answered. The county sent yet another inspector, this one asking questions about drainage and water use. I spent hours digging through old records, photocopying deeds, and calling clerks who sounded apologetic but helpless. "These complaints just keep coming," one admitted. "We're required to investigate." One morning, as I pruned the vines, I saw Richard watching from the sidewalk. He had his arms crossed, aviators glinting in the sunlight. I ignored him, focusing on the shears in my hands, but I could feel his gaze drilling into me. Finally, I turned and met his stare. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he raised one hand and gave a slow, deliberate salute, mocking, almost daring me to react. My blood boiled. I gripped the shears tighter, imagining for one dangerous second what it would feel like to march over and end this charade instead. I dropped them and walked inside, shaking with rage. Eleanor looked at me, concern etched on her face. "He's trying to make you snap," she said softly. Don't give him the satisfaction, but the truth was I was already snapping. I could feel the edges of myself fraying each day, the weight of his silent war pressing harder. Richard believed in control above all else, and he thought he had me cornered. What he didn't understand was that desperation breeds defiance. He wanted to break me. Instead, he was forging something far more dangerous, because I had decided if he wanted a war, I would give him one. And this time, it wouldn't be fought on his terms. The first counterstrike came quietly. I knew Richard wanted me to lash out, to make some reckless move he could twist into evidence of my instability. Instead, I did the opposite. I began digging into him. Brookhaven Ridge wasn't the fortress he wanted it to be. It was a community of people who gossiped, who remembered, who whispered when they thought no one was listening. And Richard, for all his pomp and swagger, had left shadows in his past. I started small, asking casual questions at the hardware store, at church, and even at the diner down on Pine Street. People hesitated, but when I framed my curiosity as simple concern, "Retired cop, right? Seems intense. What's his story?" Tongues began to loosen. The picture that emerged was far from spotless. Richard hadn't retired with honors, as he liked to imply. He'd been forced out after a string of excessive force complaints, the kind that drew lawsuits and settlements. Word was, he carried grudges like a second badge, targeting anyone who questioned him. His ex-wife, someone whispered, had left town overnight after filing a restraining order. The details were fuzzy, but the thread was clear. Richard had spent his career clinging to power by intimidation, and when that career ended, he simply shifted the battleground. Eleanor listened as I laid it all out across our kitchen table, a makeshift dossier of printouts and scribbled notes. "So he's always been like this," she murmured. "Always needing to control, yes," I said. "And he thinks he can scare us into leaving. But we can use this." If the board knew the full story, she looked doubtful. "They won't care. They need him. He's their muscle? Then we show them he's a liability at the next HOA meeting." I stood up during the public comment period. My voice was calm, my tone measured, but every word was sharpened like a blade. I mentioned Richard's career history, the lawsuits, and the complaints. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. Had the board done due diligence before allowing him to act in a quasi-enforcement role? Were they aware of the risks of putting a man with such a record at the center of community disputes? Murmurs spread through the crowd. The board president shifted in his chair, eyes darting toward Richard. And Richard? Richard just stared at me, jaw tight, sunglasses perched on his head for once afterwards he cornered me in the parking lot. You think you're clever, he said, voice low. Words clipped. I think the truth has a way of surfacing, I replied, his face hardened. Careful. You don't know what you're playing with. I know exactly what I'm playing with, I said. Though my heart was hammering in my chest for a moment, I thought he might swing at me. Instead, he leaned in so close I could smell the faint tang of tobacco on his breath. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Then he turned and stalked into the night. The next day grew darker. Our mailbox was vandalized, smashed open with a bat. The county sent another inspector, this one with a citation for unauthorized grading, though I hadn't touched the soil in months. When I asked where the complaint came from, the inspector only shrugged. Anonymous tip. Garbage bags were dumped at our gate one morning, torn open so raccoons could scatter the contents across the drive. Eleanor began waking in the middle of the night, convinced she heard footsteps outside. I started sleeping in the den with a shotgun propped against the wall, listening for the crunch of gravel, but even as Richard escalated, so did I filed public records request, digging deeper into his past. I found court filings, transcripts, and news clippings buried in archives. One case stood out a lawsuit where Richard had been accused of fabricating evidence to nail a suspect he was certain was guilty. The city had settled quietly, but the stain lingered. I printed it all, bound it in a folder, and mailed copies to every board member. No cover letter. No explanation. Just facts laid bare. The fallout was immediate. At the next board meeting, Richard wasn't standing tall at the front of the room. He was seated, arms crossed, glaring daggers while the president fumbled through an agenda clearly designed to avoid controversy. Whispers rippled through the audience, neighbors glancing at him with unease. He could feel it. His armor was cracking that night. A rock shattered our front window. Eleanor screamed as glass rained across the living room. I rushed outside, shotgun in hand, but the street was empty, the night silent except for the cicadas. On the porch, I found a scrap of paper weighed down by the rock. Leave while you can. Eleanor wanted to call the police, but I knew better. Richard still had friends, contacts, and favors banked from his years on the force. Reporting him might only tip him off, giving him the chance to spin the narrative. No, this wasn't a fight for the authorities. This was personal, neighbor against neighbor. The tension ate at us. Meals grew quiet. Eleanor spent more time in the garden, avoiding my eyes, her hands trembling as she worked the soil. I tried to reassure her, but I could see the toll it was taking. The vineyard that once symbolized peace had become a fortress, its rows of vines like battlements in a war no one else could see. Then, one morning, I caught him. I had risen early before dawn, walking the rows with a flashlight. The beam caught movement near the shed, a shadow slipping along the fence line. My heart lurched. I raised the light, and there he was. Richard crouched low, a pair of bolt cutters glinting in his hand. For a split second, our eyes locked. Then he bolted. I chased him, fury surging through my veins, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. He was fast for his age, his frame cutting through the night like a predator. But I was faster in that moment, driven by rage and something deeper, something primal. I cornered him near the edge of the property, breath ragged, shotgun slung over my shoulder. What the hell do you think you're doing? I roared. He straightened slowly, with no hint of shame, his expression calm. Making sure the community stays safe by breaking into my shed? By stopping you before you become a danger. His voice was steady, as if he truly believed the words. You're insane, I spat. He took a step closer, his eyes cold, predatory. No, unnecessary. People need order. They crave it. Without it, everything falls apart. You don't belong here because you refuse orders. You're chaos. And chaos has no place in Brookhaven Ridge. For a long moment I stood there, gripping the flashlight, chest heaving. Part of me wanted to raise the shotgun, to end it right then and there. But another part of me knew that was exactly what he wanted, a chance to paint me as the dangerous one, the unstable outlier. So instead I stepped back. Get off my property, I said, voice shaking with restrained fury. Next time, I won't just be holding a flashlight. His lips curled into that same cold smile. Then he slipped into the shadows and was gone. I stood alone in the vineyard, the vines whispering in the breeze, the weight of the confrontation heavy on my shoulders. The war with Richard Harlow had crossed a line. This was no longer about letters or bylaws. This was about survival, and deep down, I knew the real fight was only just beginning. The gavel cracked against the wooden block, sharp enough to make even Richard flinch. The HOA's monthly meeting had drawn a record crowd that evening. Every folding chair in the clubhouse was filled, and latecomers leaned against the walls, arms crossed, faces tight. The air was thick and humid with the scent of too many bodies pressed into too small a space, all waiting for a fight. I stood near the back, Eleanor's hand clasped around mine, her knuckles white. Richard sat front and center like a general preparing for battle, his jaw rigid, a man who thought victory was already his. The board president cleared her throat, her voice wavering over the microphone. Tonight's agenda includes a property violation complaint filed by Officer Richard Harlow against the residents of Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. Her eyes flickered toward us, uneasy. She had the look of someone who regretted ever allowing Richard into their orbit, but fear bound her. He had turned himself into the HOAS enforcer, their blunt instrument. Every time they hesitated, Richard reminded them of rules, bylaws, and the importance of order. He made them believe he was indispensable. Richard rose to his feet with theatrical confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming, "we're not here to attack anyone personally. We're here to protect our community, to maintain the values, the order, and the safety of Brookhaven Ridge. And what do we have across the fence line?" He jabbed a finger in my direction. "An unregulated vineyard. Structures built without permits. Activities that threaten the property values of everyone sitting in this room. If we don't act now, tomorrow it will be chickens, then RVS, then God knows what else. A neighborhood without rules is chaotic. And I don't think any of us moved here for chaos." A rumble of agreement moved through the crowd, though just as many shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could see the cracks in his control already. He had followers, yes, but also skeptics, neighbors who liked their wine tastings on our porch, who had accepted bottles from Eleanor's careful hands, who knew us not as intruders but as friends. Still, Richard's voice had a way of sounding final, like there was no room for dissent. When my turn came, I stepped forward. My heart pounded, but my words carried steady. "My wife and I have lived on that property for 30 years. Longer than most of you have called Brookhaven Ridge home. Our vineyard is not a business, it's our garden, our life's passion. And it's not under your jurisdiction. Our land predates the HOA, and that fact is written into county records. We've never diminished your property values. If anything, we've added to them. Ask yourself how many of you have enjoyed a glass of wine on our porch? How many of you have sent your children over to feed grapes to our dog? Richard wants you to believe order is the same as control. But I ask you, is your peace of mind worth surrendering your freedom to one man?" For the first time, the room didn't murmur in Richard's favor. Silence hung, a silence heavy with thought. Eleanor squeezed my hand, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. Richard's face darkened. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, not publicly. His mouth tightened into a line, then curled into something uglier. "You talk about freedom," Richard snapped. "But freedom without rules is anarchy. I spent 30 years in law enforcement, cleaning up the mess of people who thought they were above the rules. Do you want a drunk driver plowing through your cul-de-sac? Do you want squatters setting up shop? It starts small, people. It starts with one property ignoring the bylaws, and it ends with your home being worthless. If we allow him to ignore the rules, then why have an HOA at all?" The board president shifted in her seat, her face pale. The pressure was immense, two sides staring her down. The room split like a log under an axe. She reached for her water glass with a trembling hand. We will review the complaint and issue a decision in due course," she managed. But Richard wasn't satisfied with the delay. He turned toward the crowd, his voice rising to a dangerous crescendo. "No, we don't need more delay. We need action. Right now, a vote?" He slammed his palm against the table so hard the microphone squealed. "All in favor of forcing the Whitmores into compliance or eviction, raise your hand." Chaos exploded. Some hands shot up, hesitant but visible. Others shouted objections, voices colliding like waves against rocks. "This isn't on the agenda." Someone cried, "You can't vote on private property." Another yelled. Richard's face gleamed with sweat, veins standing out in his neck. He thrived on the heat of conflict, feeding on it like fire feeds on air. I felt Eleanor tremble beside me, but I held her steady. "Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, "you're not protecting this community. You're holding it hostage. You don't care about bylaws. You care about power. But here's the truth. My property is outside your reach, and every one of these neighbors knows it. So vote if you like, but you'll be voting on something you have no authority over. And when the county commissioner reads your complaint tomorrow morning, he'll see exactly what you've been doing, harassing us, abusing your position, and trying to turn good neighbors against each other." That word harassing sent a ripple through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, uneasy. Harassment meant lawsuits, liability, and exposure. Richard's eyes narrowed into slits. He wanted to strike back, but for the first time, he didn't. He saw the board president's pale face and the muttering of neighbors realizing they'd been drawn too far into his obsession. He saw his power slipping. The meeting ended not with a bang, but with a slow crumbling. The board president adjourned early, citing disorder. Neighbors filed out in tense silence, some glaring at Richard, others avoiding his eyes altogether. He stood alone at the front of the room, fists clenched, shoulders rigid. He wasn't beaten, not yet, but he had been exposed. And that exposure was a wound he couldn't easily heal outside. Night had fallen. Eleanor and I walked to our truck beneath the glow of street lamps, the air cool against our faces. She leaned against me, whispering, "You were brilliant in there. You showed them who he really is," but even as I kissed her temple, I knew Richard wasn't finished. The look in his eyes at that last moment wasn't surrender, it was promise. A promise that he'd come back harder, more dangerous. And I realized, with a chill running down my spine, that the real battle had only just begun. The night after the board meeting, our porch felt different. Usually, the vineyard glowed with peace under the silver wash of the moon, rows of vines whispering in the breeze. But that night, the silence was heavy, strained, like the calm after a storm that isn't finished. Eleanor sat beside me with her shawl pulled tight, her teacup untouched, and her gaze fixed on the fence line. Neither of us said it aloud, but both of us were waiting for Richard's next move. Days passed with eerie quiet. The neighbors we'd grown close to start checking in, some timidly, some boldly. Mrs. Lambert from down the street brought over a casserole, her way of showing solidarity. "Don't let him get under your skin," she said, though her hands trembled as she passed the dish to Eleanor. "Most of us don't agree with him. We just didn't know how to speak up." Others sent notes tucked under our door, words of encouragement, quiet acknowledgments that they'd seen Richard's obsession for what it was. Slowly, the tide shifted. The fear that Richard wielded like a baton was losing its grip. Richard, however, didn't retreat. His presence grew more ghostly, more sinister. He no longer stormed down the sidewalks in daylight barking orders. Instead, he lingered at night. I'd catch the glint of binoculars from across the hedge or the faint click of his camera shutter. He was collecting, always collecting, as though the sheer weight of his documentation might tip the scales back in his favor. But now, neighbors noticed. One evening I heard Mr. Daniels mutter loudly enough for Richard to hear, "Man's lost his mind." Spying on folks like that? Richard stiffened but said nothing. County Commissioner's office eventually sent their official letter, sealed in thick cream paper, delivered by post. I unfolded it at the kitchen table while Eleanor held her breath. The verdict was clear. Richard's complaints held no legal ground. Our property, established before the HOA, was exempt. His authority ended at the edge of his manicured lawn. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the relief settle deep into my bones. Eleanor cried quietly into her hands, shoulders shaking. We had won, not just technically, but officially. We had protection now, armor against Richard's endless warren, yet victory didn't feel like celebration. It felt like standing on a battlefield after the smoke clears, the ground scarred and silent. Richard had been humiliated, but humiliation doesn't break a man like him, it hardens him. That was what worried me. Weeks later, an envelope arrived in our mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed neatly with no signature. "Enjoy your little victory. You can't hide behind paperwork forever. I see everything." Eleanor gasped when she read it, her face pale. My stomach knotted, but instead of fear, I felt resolve harden inside me. Enough was enough. Richard wanted to play watchdog. Then the community needed to see what kind of watchdog he really was. I started documenting him. Every time I saw him lurking with his binoculars, I snapped my own photo. When he crept by our fence at midnight, I recorded the time. I even set up a trail camera angled at the property line, catching his shadowy figure more than once. I compiled it all in a neat file, not unlike the one he had surely built on us. Only mine told the truth. The turning point came at the next HOA gathering. This time, the board didn't invite Richard to speak, they asked me. When I stood at the podium, the room was quieter and more expectant than before. I opened the folder and laid out the photos, one by one, across the table. These, I said, were taken over the last month. They show Richard trespassing, stalking, and surveilling us. This isn't about bylaws or property values anymore. This is harassment. This is an obsession. And it endangers not only us, but also every one of you who has watched him claim authority he doesn't possess. Rippled. Whispers stirred. Richard sat stiffly in the front row, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles gleamed white. When he tried to interrupt, the board president silenced him sharply. Officer Harlow, sit down. We'll hear you when it's your turn. It wasn't just her words, it was her tone. The fear was gone when the board finally addressed him. Their voices were no longer apologetic. Your behavior is unacceptable. You've overstepped your role. Effective immediately, you are barred from enforcing HOA matters. The statement landed like a hammer. For a man who had built his second life on wielding control, it was the cruelest cut. Richard's face drained of color, then flushed an angry red. He stood, fists trembling, but the eyes of the entire room pressed him back into silence. For the first time since he'd marched into Brookhaven, Richard Harlow had been stripped of his badge, even if it was only the imaginary one he'd pinned to himself after that night. Brookhaven Ridge began to breathe again. Neighbors waved more, lingered longer in driveways, and came back to our vineyard for evenings of laughter and wine. The fear that had once curled around every conversation loosened. Children biked freely again, their laughter ringing down the cul-de-sac without Richard's shadow looming. Peace, tentative but real, returned. Richard remained, of course. He didn't move away, though whispers suggested he might. Instead, he kept to himself, his once commanding stride reduced to a quiet shuffle. Sometimes I'd catch him staring across the street, his eyes hard and hollow. But when our gazes met, it was he who looked away first. That was the truest sign of change, not a letter from the county, not the board's decision, but the simple fact that Richard no longer dared to confront us directly on our porch one evening. Eleanor leaned her head against my shoulder, watching the vineyard glow under the sunset. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. I took her hand, warm and familiar in mine, and thought carefully before answering. With men like Richard, it's never really over. But it's enough. Enough for us to live, to breathe, to enjoy what we built. And that's what matters. We sat there until the last of the light faded, vines swaying gently as if nodding in agreement. Peace wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was ours, reclaimed and guarded not by fences or bylaws, but by the quiet strength of standing together against a bully. And for the first time in months, I felt certain Brookhaven Ridge belonged not to Richard Harlow, but to all of us who refused to bow. Now I ask you, would you have stood up to Richard if he were your neighbor, or would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know what you'd do.
This was just one story, but the next one will be even more dramatic. Are you ready? Then you need to subscribe to HOA Stories 87 right now. Like this video, share it with your friends, and hit the bell because the next story might sound a little too close to home.